It's my great pleasure to introduce our chair for the day, for today's conversation, David Goodhart, who'll be introducing John. I should just say that both John and David are old friends of mine. John Kampfner used to occasionally print articles I'd written in the New Statesman before he left. I don't know if there's any connection between him leaving and him printing my articles. And David is going to print an article by me in the next edition of Prospect, aren't you, David?
So he thinks, yeah.
Oh, right. It's on that basis that you're here. Anyway, David is founder and editor of Prospect magazine, the influential current affairs monthly, a former FT journalist. He writes regularly for a range of publications, including The Guardian and The Times, and has been a key figure in the debate, public debate on citizenship in recent years. We're delighted you've been able to join us, and can I ask you to welcome David Goodhart.
Well, in the chain of welcoming, I now want to welcome John Kampfner, who I've also known for quite a long time. In fact, going back to the days when we were correspondents together in Bonn in Germany, then West Germany, before the wall came down in the late 80s. And I guess it's from the fall of that wall that your thesis has emerged, some of which I think hits the nail on the head, some of which I think is somewhat misconceived, but we'll deal with that later. Anyway, John moved on from Bonn to various other global capitals, and then probably came into some of your lives when he came back here and became editor of the New Statesman, which he did for 3 years and did a pretty good job. We were competitors, and I did start reading it again when you were editor. And he has now moved on from that and runs Index on Censorship, the free speech NGO. Is that the correct description?
That's a good expression.
Anyway, just John is going to not deliver, as it were, a formal 20-minute lecture, but talk around the themes in his book for 10 minutes or so. I might then have a bit of a go at him, and then we'll open it to discussion and close a bit past 2. So you go ahead first.
Thank you very much. Thank you, David. Good afternoon, everybody. I was keen, because of the nature of the RSA, which I'm proud to be a fellow, and this audience, to devote as much time as possible to questions and answers, to your observations, and obviously David's as well. Just without extending the introduction too much, I'm very pleased that David is chairing it, and because we, I think in the best sense of the terms, we were friends and rivals, and we do have quite a strong difference of view on I would say, on UK politics and assessment of the last 10 or 12 years, particularly in the domestic arena. So that area in particular, for those who may so far be acquainted with the book, there are 8 country studies, 8 chapters relating to specific countries. I'll explain more during my observations. One of those countries is the UK, and that is obviously one where I think we will have a good, strong difference of view. I'll just set out in maybe a dozen or so bullet points the questions I ask in this book, the questions I hope that I answer, and observations that I make, really to throw it open to David and to you. I suppose the first question is, why is it that so many people around the world, in different countries, living under different systems, with different historical and cultural circumstances, why is it, nevertheless, that they universally, to a greater or lesser extent, appear willing to give up certain freedoms in return for either prosperity or security, or the promise of either or both? It is the dispensability of what I call public freedoms that I regard as the most disappointing and alarming aspect of this period of globalization since the fall of the Berlin Wall exactly 20 years ago. Now, this trade-off between liberty on the one side and either prosperity or security, or both, on the other, is what I call the pact. In each country it varies. People hand over different liberties and according to their customs and priorities. It could be press freedom, it could be universal suffrage, it could be transparency, accountability, it could be an impartial judiciary, it could be living your life without being intruded upon, spied upon, your communications being intercepted, or other such manifestations. I differentiate between private freedoms and public freedoms. What I would contend, and this book is not about totalitarian states. The only mention you hear of, you read in the book, of North Korea, Zimbabwe, Burma, even Iran, is in the introduction in order to say these are not states I'm talking about. I'm not talking about states where people are fearful to step outside, where they are dictated to either literally or metaphorically at the point of the gun. I am talking much more about a sense of cooperation, a sense of collusion, and I'll develop that thought. And what the freedoms that have been given and won and maintained over the last 20 years are what I call private freedoms. Now, in those countries where they didn't exist, they're absolutely vital, and they are not in any way to be dismissed. But they are quite specific. They are the freedom to travel. They're the freedom to carry out, conduct a business without a sense of the arbitrary seizure of assets, sequestration, jackboots through the door, closing companies down, contracts being torn up. Very important, that is too. It's the right to own property without that property being seized. It's the right to lead your private, personal, sexual life in exactly the way you wish. It is the state withdrawing from your own personal life, from your personal space. And in those countries where that has happened, that has produced a great benefit to people. However, in this trade-off, there can be a trade-off with public freedoms. In return for the state not interfering with my life, I will not interfere unduly in the life of the state. And the phrase I use time and again is, I will not cause trouble. And who actually does cause trouble? It's actually a tiny minority of people, a tiny minority of people in public life. It is investigative journalists. It is activists. It is lawyers who defend any of the above. It is recalcitrant and uncompromising oppositionist politicians. And if a state can isolate or marginalize by any of several means those people, then it has secured this trade-off of providing private freedoms in return for dominating the public space. What happened, and this particularly applied, I would contend, to the middle classes. The model for this New World Order is the state where I was born, which I visit quite frequently, which is quite specific, but I would contend shares many of the values that I talk about and actually is the model for these values, and that is Singapore. I never cease to be intrigued by my friends with whom I spent many years and who come in and out of London every 5 minutes, and I see them there and I see them in other places, Hong Kong, elsewhere, who are very well traveled. They have extremely high levels of education, tertiary education, and yet they quite willingly and knowledgeably subscribe to this trade-off. And I don't dismiss it out of hand. I want to understand why it is they do it, because it is, to a large extent, a voluntary trade-off. During these past 2 decades of what I call globalized glut, the preeminent freedom was financial. This was the right to earn money and to consume it unimpeded. And political leaders from our very own Gordon Browns and many others beside even extol shopping as a patriotic duty. And that is the most preeminent right in public life. We have allowed, I argue, democracy to mutate into something it should never have become. It has become primarily a vehicle to deliver consumption. I regard the greatest culprit in this as not being politicians. It is in the DNA of a politician, and there's nothing necessarily wrong with it, to seek power by fair means, sometimes by foul, to seek to consolidate and extend that and prolong that power by fair means or foul. It is really for us to determine this question of the kinds of freedoms that we wish to have and to resist this pull towards ceding what I call the public space. I would argue that the greater culprits in this trade-off have been we, people in the West, less so people in countries where the acquisition of private freedoms were new freedoms and therefore to be valued. So in summation, I look at 8 countries. In order, they are as follows. There's Singapore, which I regard as the model. China, which has been studying the Singapore model, particularly at a regional and city level for some time. I spent some time at the National University of Singapore, and I was fascinated to hear the extent to which Chinese civic society and political leaders do seek to understand, transfer onto a hugely larger scale the Singapore model, with a considerable degree of success. Russia, which I would argue is anything but an example of success when it comes to the application either of private freedoms, let alone public freedoms, but certainly has been a model of success if you regard as the opening up of a country as delivering consumer durables and extraordinary wealth to a small number of people. The 4th chapter in what I call the authoritarian section is the UAE. It's more of a vignette, Dubai, Abu Dhabi, and the trade-offs that have happened there, allowing these places to be the center of the financial acquisition of wealth. Of the 4 democracies, which I imagine will be the more contentious areas, I start with India, and I look at the extent to which it's a different trade-off, I contend, in India. It has been the withdrawal of the middle classes from public life in order to secure a fantastically high level of material well-being in an atomized fashion. And the terrorist attacks in Mumbai in November of last year were an extraordinary wake-up call to that middle class that actually of a need to engage in many of these issues which it had pretty much ceded to a small minority of politicians. The next one is Italy, which is extremely colourful account, obviously, of Berlusconi, but carries a more important message. Not just a man of a sexually crazed man and a buffoon to boot. That bit you can dismiss. What is interesting is how come a country which, by all international norms, passes all tests of constitutional and political theory, can nevertheless elect a man 3 times who has embarked upon a systematic assault on the independence of the judiciary and the media. To do it 3 times knowingly in unfixed elections is quite interesting to note. The UK, we can discuss. My contention is one of great disappointment with the last 12 years of New Labour in its approach to civil liberties. I argue quite strongly that the liberal left has ceded much of the human rights, civil liberties agenda to the right, which is repackaging it in a more atomized libertarian format, and a lot of rethinking needs to be done in that way. And then finally, the United States, which I argue, in spite of 8 years of both above board deliberate and popular recalibration of American society following on from the events of 9/11 towards a stronger security agenda, plus some underhand actions as well. Nevertheless, America, through its constitutional norms and through its obsessive, and I regard this in a positive way, obsessive interest and passion about these issues, about the Constitution and the amendments, particularly the First Amendment therein, has actually emerged in reasonable shape in spite of the past 8 years. I started on this book regarding it almost as in that classic genre of the last 10 or 20 years of East versus West, New World Order, the Robert Kagans, the Kishore Mahbubanis, Fareed Zakarias, and many other besides. It ended in a different way, arguing that actually we, East and West, in the citizens' voluntary ceding of public freedoms in return for consumer lifestyles, are actually much closer to each other than we think. And with that, over to you, David.
Well, I think I might just make a few comments on the international side, and perhaps we can come on to Britain a bit later. I thought a lot of the international stuff was very interesting. Singapore was fascinating. I thought you really hit the nail on the head in the India chapter, which I think probably does conform to your thesis almost better than anywhere else in terms of middle class opting out. Yeah, I can't help thinking that things are still a lot better now, looking around the world, than they were before 1989. I thought you perhaps didn't give sufficient credit to the advances that have been made. I think you're also measuring often, although there are various disclaimers against this, but I think you are measuring the rest of the world against a very high Western liberal democratic standard. And the truth of the matter is that there are very few places in the world that, through historical accident, have states that are neither too strong nor too weak. They first emerged in Europe in the 16th, 17th century and developed first through liberal constitutionalism and later to full-fledged electoral democracy. And I think that's another point that you perhaps underplay, is the extent to which the distinction between liberal constitutionalism. I mean, we were a very liberal country in many ways in the 19th, perhaps not so much the 18th century, but we certainly weren't a democracy until well into the 20th century. And that is possibly less true. I mean, in other parts of the world, perhaps partly as a result of Western dominance, that they've gone for electoral democracy before the liberal constitutionalism. And in many cases, many countries that are ethnically or religiously divided, this has been a bit of a disaster. But I'm given I mean, one of the things that surprised me reading the book was knowing that, something I should have mentioned, of course, at the beginning, that you're probably most famous in this country for your Blair's Wars book. And yet, reading this book, you would have thought that you'd been rather approving of Tony Blair's attempt to take Western liberalism to the benighted peoples of the Middle East. Of course, there were no weapons of mass destruction. There were all sorts of different arguments presented for it. But I mean, that your thesis that all these places are failing to live up to democratic standards, Blair was at least trying to do something about in a cat-candid way. Anyway, I mean, it also occurred to me actually that if I was a poor person in a developing country, I would certainly want wealth and security before democracy. I mean, democracy comes way, way down the list of most people's requirements for very good reason. It doesn't feed your children. It doesn't protect you from marauding warlords. I mean, it's quite appropriately some way down the list. And as I say, historically, I mean, where democracy has taken root, effectively, it's only after often several hundred years of non-democratic but sort of liberal constitutional development, the rule of law and development of public space and the idea of accountability and restrictions on the power of the state or the monarch. So a very slow and gradual process. And It's not happening in many places. I say they've often got it the wrong way round in a way, perhaps partly as a result of Western influence.
Shall I just come back to you on those points?
Come back on that, and perhaps we might we could sort of do the UK bit.
Yeah, sure. No, there's a huge amount of food for thought in what you say. On your in reverse order, on the question of sequencing, the "give us more time, we're getting there" school of thought, which I heard a lot and quite convincingly in China, I heard a lot and much less convincingly in Russia and elsewhere. That obviously is a hypothetical. I would argue quite a different thesis, and I hope people see this as a book that is teasing out these ideas, investigating. It is not a polemic. I'm trying to look at why it is, rather than isn't it terrible that this is the case. And the Barrington-Moore thesis, which pretty much was the template of the post-1989 agenda, which is the more you can increase, the more you can infuse into a country free markets, and the more you can increase the size and the power of the middle class, the more by definition you're going to increase democracy and the public space, because when you become more comfortable you have more time and you want to be more involved in debate and all of that. I simply see very little evidence that this has happened. It is quite possible, and I think in fact if I haven't proven the thesis, I've gone some way to pointing it out, that you can create a comfortable middle class that is quite comfortable with simply being comfortable. It is quite comfortable with simply being there. I've got my gated community. I've got my big house. I don't need to get involved in everything that's going on out there. In fact, it could be deleterious to my business interests, to my family's general well-being. So this link between, which was very much the post-1989 scenario, the link between the spreading of democracy and the spreading of free markets, I venture to suggest has been decoupled. And therein lies the disappointment, and therein lies, it is not, I lived in the Soviet Union for several years. I visited Mao's China before Deng. It is not, there is no comparison with what happened there. The provision of private freedom and material wealth since those eras is unarguable. It is the fact that democracy, either by accident or by design, it's a bit of both depending on which country you're in, has mutated into a consumer delivery mechanism rather than the bigger, more emancipating, empowering, I don't like those words, they're a bit sort of NGO-ish, but I know, we don't use that language. But the more important public area, and that I see as the lost opportunity. So when people say we're getting there, just give us more time, I argue, actually, I don't think you're getting there. Not because you're no good, because I don't think you want to get there. I don't think there is a critical mass in your own countries, let alone in other countries, for wanting to get there. And that is my contention. And on your point about, now is certainly not the time to rehearse arguments on Iraq, but I covered the massacres in Rwanda in 1994. I was never averse to the notion of humanitarian intervention, that the whole ICISS school of thought. What happened, briefly, in my view, with Iraq, was that it shattered the credibility, both through what actually happened in Iraq and the processes, the international, the processes that took place within countries and within international institutions. It shattered that otherwise laudable theory, and it's much harder now, as we're seeing with Burma, as we're seeing in other places, it's not the West, for the international community to push for these universal values in the post-Iraq world. But that's all I'll say on that front.
Just to come back very quickly on the quiescent middle class thesis. I mean, could it not be that in certain countries such as India, the middle class seems quiescent because actually it has got, as you suggest, most of what it wants and needs, things that perhaps were struggled for over centuries in Western countries in earlier centuries. But it has habeas corpus, it has sort of freedom of movement, it has freedom of contract, most important for the commercial middle class. So its interests are represented there, and that a form of liberal constitutionalism has been established, which may or may not develop into properly functioning electoral democracy. In which case, sort of, what's the problem?
Yeah, if you narrow the argument down to a caucus lobbying for its own interests, then absolutely you are right. If you lead a gated life, both physically and metaphorically, and you do get what you want, a policeman does not arbitrarily hit you on the head. The courts will treat you properly if you belong to that group. And if you see your role in public life as to preserve your either individual or your collective self-interest, then I would agree that they have got exactly what they want. But I would say more ambitious Indian intellectuals and members of public life, politicians and others would argue that that is grossly insufficient.